the forum for what promises to be a deeply engaging and a thoughtful discussion. My name is Raid Azam, and I have the honor of coordinating and hosting today's session. This webinar is part of the forum's continuing efforts to create spaces for rigorous, inclusive, and evidence-based engagement with India's past, particularly at a time when historical narratives are frequently contested, reinterpreted, or selectively presented in public discourse. For many of you joining us today, this session offers a unique opportunity not just to listen, but to reflect on how historical narratives are shaped, challenged, and sometimes distorted, and to consider the broader responsibility that we all share in engaging thoughtfully with history. We hope that today's discussion will encourage careful inquiry and thinking, and a deeper appreciation of how the past is written, taught, and understood. Before we move on to the speaker, it is important to briefly introduce the Indian History Forum. It should be noted that this was established as a platform for balanced, evidence-based, and inclusive historical scholarship. Its mission is to advance inclusive and balanced history by striving to promote scholarship that highlights India's diverse past, fosters understanding, and builds a more inclusive historical national narrative. The forum's vision is also equally as important. By connecting the past and the present, the forum aims to create a collaborative space where historians, researchers, and the public explore India's shared legacy, making history a bridge rather than a barrier. The forum undertakes a variety of different initiatives to achieve these goals. These include commissioning archival and field-based research, hosting thematic discussions with both established scholars and emerging researchers, and curating an exhibition that brings historical research to the public eye in an accessible and engaging format. By attending this webinar, you're participating in the forum's broader effort to foster understanding, inclusivity, and dialogue around India's history. To stay connected with the forum's activities, including upcoming webinars, publications, and the exhibition, you're encouraged to follow the forum on Instagram and to visit its website. These platforms will allow you to remain engaged with the forum and to become a part of the forum's growing community. Through these efforts, the forum demonstrates that history is not only about scholarship, but also about making knowledge accessible, meaningful, and reflective of India's rich and diverse past. The topic of today's session is particularly important because NCERT textbooks are central to how students across India encounter history. These textbooks are often the first and sometimes only structured introduction to India's past for millions of students nationwide. Because of this influential position, it is vital to examine how narratives are presented, framed, or even omitted, and to understand the impact of ideological perspectives on historical knowledge. When textbooks are selectively edited, misinterpreted, or infused with political narratives, they do not simply convey history, they shape public understanding, social consciousness, and civic imagination for generations. This webinar will provide an opportunity to explore these dynamics critically. By examining how historical narratives are constructed, contested, and sometimes distorted, you will gain insight into the responsibility shared by historians, educators, and citizens alike. Understanding the past is not only an academic exercise, it informs our decisions, our public discourse, and our collective values. Now, it is my honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ruchika Sharma. Dr. Sharma is a Delhi-based historian and an alumna of Jawaharlal Nehru University, one of the leading research institutions in India. That's the place where she has completed her PhD from, and she has been involved in academic teaching and research. Her training as a historian forms the foundation of her work in both scholarly and in public-facing spaces. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Sharma has made significant contributions in public history. She runs the YouTube series Eyeshadow and Etihas. She has participated in multiple podcasts, such as the Credible History channel, and she has engaged in several TV debates. Across all of these platforms, she has dedicated a substantial amount of time to countering false narratives, debunking myths, and challenging ideological impositions that are increasingly circulated in popular media and education. Her work is a popular example of how rigorous historical research can be made more accessible to the public, encouraging critical engagement and promoting informed understanding. Dr. Sharma demonstrates how historians can actively participate in public conversations, ensuring that knowledge is not only preserved in academic circles, but is also shared, scrutinized, and understood by a wider audience. The Indian History Forum is proud to host Dr. Ruchika Sharma here today, and I am confident that her insights will be instructive and inspiring for every single one of us here today. A brief note on how the session's format will work. Dr. Sharma will now begin with her talk, and once her presentation concludes, we will open the floor for questions. I encourage all of you to type your questions in the chat box, and as many as possible will be answered during the question and answer segment. On behalf of the Indian History Forum, it is now my privilege to hand over the session to Dr. Ruchika Sharma. Thank you, ma'am.
Hi, thank you, Rai. Just a question before I start. How long should my talk be and how much time are you allotting to question answers?
Uh, from what I know, there will be around 10 to 15 minutes for questions.
All right, perfect. So I'll keep it at 45 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining this talk. And I'm very glad that the Indian History Forum has decided to host this talk. The topic that was suggested by the Indian History Forum, and I felt that was good enough to speak about, is basically on how the NCERT is creating, a syllabus for kids which are 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old. And in that syllabus is just a lot of ideological bias. I wouldn't even say that it is history with an ideological bias, because even an ideologically biased history will have facts, right? And it will be based on certain historical facts. The problem with the NCERT is that it is ideologically biased, but also does not have, in a lot of places, sound historical facts, right? They've introduced statements which are not based in historical facts at all. And I'll come to that as well. Um, the other, of course, is that there is a clear agenda that the NCERT follows, which is of demonizing and creating this exceptional idea of the Muslim ruler. So which is why the most ideological bias are in chapters which deal with medieval Indian history, whether it is on the Mughals and the Sultans, or whether it is on on the Marathas as well. So there is interesting ways in which the Marathas have also been represented that I'm going to talk about. And there is a lot of value judgment. So if you just do a very quick semantic analysis of the NCERT textbooks of class 6th, 7th, and 8th, all of these are new. You will see that the kind of words that are used in the chapter which is on the Sultans and the Mughals versus the kind of words that are used in the chapter which is, say, on the Marathas or which is on the Cholas, they're very different, right? So, for example, words like plunder, words like loot, words like destruction, words like desecration, right, have exceptionally been used only with regards to the sultans, with regards to the Mughals, and largely medieval Indian history. And everything else, the other rulers, whether it's the Marathas or whether it's the Cholas, were apparently not looting or plundering, because this has not been mentioned with their context at all, with their historical context at all. So it's fascinating to see that as well. And of course, what's even more important is to realize that even class 11th and class 12th textbooks, which are not new, but they've been tweaked. And there are very interesting tweaks, right? So, for example, words like caste have been completely replaced by social realities, making it an extremely vague, sentence, or making that entire historical context seem completely vague and irrelevant. Because social realities could mean a lot of things, right? Social realities could also mean gender realities. Social realities could mean class realities. Social realities could mean, um, um, religious realities, right? There can be a lot of ways in which social realities could be defined. But caste reality is a very different and a very unique way in which India has functioned, the Indian society has functioned for a very long time right now. So removing the word caste and replacing that with social realities, firstly, is completely ahistorical. And it totally takes away from the specific context in which the word caste operates in, right? Secondly, it also takes away from the caste struggles of the lower caste for a very long time, saying that their struggle was just one of the social realities. And what is the big deal about it? Which is not the case at all, right? So there is also this attempt to deliberately either remove or minimize those things which are considered to be not very ideologically coherent uh, to the people who are writing the books of the NCERT. Right. And of course, there is, no words that need mincing over here. There are newspaper reports that very clearly report, as way back as 2022, that of the NCERT members, at least 24 of them have direct affiliation with the RSS. So it's not like the ideological bias is coming from some random gathering of people. This has been clearly thought through and deliberately kept in such a manner so that the RSS version of history is put out in the history textbooks or in the social science textbooks, because in 6th, 7th, 8th, you don't have a separate history textbook. So now coming back to the specifics, first, of course, is the fact that there is a lot of ideological bias. How do we know this about the NCERT? One very important example of this is the way temple destruction has been dealt with in the NCERT. Now, temple destruction is something which is not just limited to medieval Indian history. It is very clear that temple destruction has existed from as early as the 7th century. We have examples of Jain caves, rock-cut cave temples built by Jains first in Malayadakurichi, which is in Tamil Nadu, which were converted into Shaivism during the 8th century when Bhakti movement was gaining a lot of ground in the Tamil Nadu area. Right? There are temple conversions again from Jain, a Jain temple converted into a Narasimha temple, which is a Vishnu temple in Anaimalai, again in Tamil Nadu. Right? Same time period, 8th century. In fact, during this time period, we have very interesting writings by the Bhakti saints, Shaivite and Vaishnavite, both Alvars and Nayanars, saying very specifically how much they dislike the Jains, how much they dislike the Buddhists, right? So it is not like the temple conversion is one-off. It is clearly a very thought-out clash of religions where these new forms of worship, of Puranic worship, which is bhakti, right? So both Shaivism and Vaishnavism are Puranic religions. So this, but the bhakti movement is this new form of worship which is coming up in the Tamil Nadu area, right? So these want to displace the earlier forms of a non-Puranic worship, which is Buddhism and Jainism, right? So R. Champak Lakshmi, in her work on the Bhakti movement in Tamil Nadu, very clearly says that Buddhism declined as a result of Bhakti movement in Tamil Nadu. Jainism became subservient to the Puranic religions. And all of this showed in two ways. One, of course, is, of course, the temple conversion, right? But also the conversion of a lot of kings who were earlier Jains and were forcibly or were sort of, and again, there is no force over here in the sense of, I'm going to kill you if you don't convert. The force over here is very simple, that a huge number of the subjects are now either Shaivite or either Vaishnavite, and the people who are popular, the saints who are popular, are also now Shaivite and Vaishnavite. So a lot of rulers were sort of coerced into converting. So one of the most common conversions, one of the most famous conversions was this of this ruler, this Pandya ruler called Arikesari Maravarman, who ruled from 670 to 700 CE. And his conversion led to many rock-cut cave temples in the Pandya territory to be converted from Jainism to Shaivism. right? So all of this works in tandem. So if you look at the writings in, say, Tevaram, or if you look at the writings of the Nayanar saints, you will see that they are very clear about how the Jains are wicked, they are, manipulative, and they should not be. Apar himself, Apar is one of the three most important Bhakti saints, Apar, Sambandar, and Sundarar. Apar himself very clearly says that he was a Jain at one point of time and he converted into Shaivism. And he says that, it was a huge mistake to have been a Jain at one point of time. And that is because their beliefs are completely useless. They fast, for example, something called a Salekhan that the Jains do, which is they fast onto death, right? A lot of Bhakti saints thought that this was completely useless. Tontira Potti, another saint, Bhakti saint, was of the opinion that Jains and Buddhists should have their heads chopped off, right? So this is a very interesting way in which the 7th, 8th, 9th century in the Tamilakam area is playing out. There is clear religious conflict. But and a lot of that sort of manifests itself in temple destruction, in temple conversions as well. And the conversions are very interesting, right? So what changes, what converts is basically the sanctum sanctorum, which is the Garbhagriha, which is the main part of a temple, right? So if when it was a Jain temple, there was a image of the Parsvanath, the Jina Parsvanath, you would remove that, right? And instead of that, you will place a Shivling if it's to be a Shaiva temple, or an image of Vishnu if it's to be a Vaishnava temple. Everything else more or less remains the same. So a lot of these rock cut cave temples that I was talking about in the, that went under conversion in the 8th century, you will see that a lot of them still carry, Jain figures, Jain sculptural reliefs on the walls, right? Which have partially been erased and partially been left as it is, right? Because as historians have pointed out, a lot of the Jain temple architecture is very similar to the Hindu temple architecture as well. In fact, a lot of the Jain deities, for example, this concept of depicting the Ashtadikpal, or the 8 guardian deities of the temple, is something that was there in Jainism as well. Right, so you would have Indra, Agni, Som, Surya, all of these. These are one of the 9 Ashtadikpal. One of the 8 Ashtadikpal, right? And they would also be depicted on Shaiv temples and on Vaishnav temples. So there is no idea that you will not depict them simply because they're Jains. So, which is why it's very difficult to also understand that this used to be once a Jain temple and now is changed. A lot of the times the inscriptions help. There are inscriptions which say that this used to be this once and now we've changed. But otherwise also, this defacement of sculptures or erasing of sculptures also tells us that this was once clearly of a different religion and now is of a different religion. But what is interesting is that 2 things come out in this. One is, of course, that there is temple conversion happening, which is, the superficial, the more easy thing to understand. The other is to realize that religion at that point of time is not how we understand it today, right? We think of it in these colonial binaries, which the colonial people drew for us, which is that Hindu. And sadly, when they did Hindu, they put even Buddhism and Jainism as part of it, right? Which is absolutely ridiculous, because Buddhism and Jainism were clearly non-Vedic, non-Puranic religions. In fact, they came as an opposition to the Vedic religion, right? So to club them in the same group where Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shaktaism is there is completely ridiculous, but they did it, right? So what happens then is that even a Jain temple, even a Buddhist stupa, is now looked at as a Hindu structure, and anything which is not that is looked at as a Muslim structure, right? And therefore, when you talk about temple destruction, you're only then talking about what Muslims did to Hindus, which is not the case. Because if you look at religion in the 8th century, in the subcontinent, in the Tamilakam area, it's very different, right? I just, gave you examples of how the Shaivites and the Vaishnavites, the Alvars and the Nainars, really want to displace both Buddhism and Jainism from the area so that they can get the patronage of the kings, so that they can have the temples, so that they can popularize their religion. Right? So at that point of time, religion is not a binary. There is no idea that this Jain person and this Shaivite person are of the same religion. No. Imagine if you would ever tell Appar that your religion as a Shaivite is the same as that of a Jain. He would probably have a very violent reaction to it. These are people who are writing that the heads of the Jains and the Buddhists should be chopped off. So obviously the reaction to this would be very violent, right? So it's interesting that has somehow been completely ignored. But these are, of course, smaller examples. There are even bigger examples of temple destruction, far more violent, far more apparent, right? And not just of temple conversion, right? But straight out destruction. So one of the most famous examples that I keep talking about is, of course, Harsha of Kashmir, right? In Kalhan's Raj Tarangini, broke almost all of the temples in Kashmir, looted them, appointed a person called Dev Utpat Nayak, the position of Dev Utpat Nayak, an officer responsible for destroying temples. And this person called Udayraj was appointed to that, right? This is the 12th century, 11th, 12th century ruler of Kashmir. And he's institutionalizing temple destruction. Fascinating thing, right? Just, I think 300 years before him, Shankar Varman, this ruler, this 8th century, 9th century ruler of Kashmir, goes on and loots 64 temples in Kashmir. And again, institutionalizes the looting of temples by, creating these two new revenue offices. Of one is, of course, the share of the lord of the market, wherein even the temples were taxed. Fascinatingly, right? And they were, in many cases, also overtaxed, right? And their properties were seized. So the land grants that they were getting, they were taken away by Shankar Varman. He put it in his lands and started cultivation with his own money from his own people, right? They were now his lands. Whatever revenue will come to him. It will not go to the temples anymore. So the temples lost out on those properties, right? So it's fascinating that all of this institutionalizing of temple taxation, of temple destruction is happening, but you almost never hear about it. Forget about popular discourse. That's asking too much. But even in the NCERT textbooks, this idea that there is only one kind of temple destruction that is happening, which is that the Muslims are destroying Hindu temples. The problematic idea of regarding all temples, which are or all religious structures which are non-Muslim, to be Hindu, right? And this idea, this very problematic idea that somehow temple destruction only happened for religious reasons. No, it did not. When Harsha started his temple destruction spree, one of the most violent ones, he started off financially. The reason is financial. He wanted to loot, right? And then he also went ahead and destroyed the temples. Kalha doesn't tell us why he went, from A to B, such an extreme jump, looting temples and then destroying them, and then bringing out their idols and doing all sorts of terrible things to the idols. Right? Kalhan reports he was an eyewitness to this carnage. He reports, seeing these temple idols being put out on the streets. Right? They were soiled in the mud. The saints were asked to urinate on them, right? So there were all sorts of weird things which were happening, and this complete brutality, with respect to temples at that point of time. Again, we are at a loss of the reason for it, because Kalhan doesn't tell us as to why exactly he's being so brutal to it. But clearly the reason initially is an economic one. Same for Shankar Varman. He's looting temples because there is a financial thing. But at the same point of time, there have also been religious reasons. There's no doubt that, like I've just given you examples, this conversion, temple conversion, which is happening during the Bhakti movement, is clearly because of religious conflicts. Right. Similarly, you have another example from Kashmir, this person called Kshemagupt, who burns an entire stupa and a vihara, the Jayendra Vihara, right? Again, comes from Kalhan Rajtarangini. He's a 10th century ruler. He burns the entire vihara, Jayendra Vihara, simply because one of his feudal lords is inside that particular vihara. A person called Sangram, he's a Damar. Damar means a feudal lord in Kashmir at that point of time. So he burns the entire monastery and then takes the brass from the idol of Saugata, which is Buddha, and uses that as a foundational stone for his Shaiva temple of Kshemagaurishwar. Interestingly, this is also, again, the time period wherein down south, the Bhakti movement is in full swing. And Buddhism and Jainism is being displaced by Shaivism. You have similar examples in north as well, with this Kshemagupt person who's doing something similar. This is a very clear, so it starts off political. He wants to take revenge from his Damar, right? But it quickly escalates. The action and the reaction just doesn't match, right? The action is that the feudal lord goes and, shuts himself in a vihar. Instead of storming the vihar or sending the army inside and catching him, he burns the entire vihar. So clearly this idea is that the vihar is useless. I can totally burn it. And then I can use the idol of the Buddha and put it as a foundational stone for my new Shaiva temples. There is a clear religious angle to it, so you cannot ignore that. Right? So there have been many reasons as to why temples were destroyed. But if you read the NCERT, they will tell you only Muslims destroyed it, and they only did it for religion. Which I think does two things. One, of course, is it creates this idea that somehow only Muslims were some of these barbaric rulers who went ahead and did whatever the NCERT says they did. But more than that, it also gives a very incomplete and non-factual history of temple destruction, right? Because religion wasn't the only reason, and Muslims weren't the only rulers who were doing temple destruction. Temple destruction, according to me, because I've done my MPhil and I've also sort of tried to introduce in my PhD, because it's something which is very close to my heart, and I've spent a lot of time studying about it. I think it's a fascinating thing, and kids must be taught about this, because it really tells you as to how what we think of religion today was now not how it was. What we think of as temples today was not how it was, right? Clearly, these kings are going and looting temples simply because they know that the temples have money, that the temple is also an economic institution. And they were economic institutions. They would hold markets. They would organize these hearts where they would be a producer as well as a consumer. And a share of that market would go to them. They would earn something by organizing these markets. They were engaging in trade, right? Again, as a producer and a consumer. Many temples had factories attached to them. So it's fascinating as to how the temple itself is an economic institution, and therefore there are kings who went ahead to loot its wealth when they were short of money in their own royal treasury. So it will tell the kid, who's studying, if it's a dream come true if it at all is dealt with that sort of sensitivity in NCERT textbook that it requires. But the kid would then learn that temples, again, as we think of today, were not the same. Right? There is so much that one can actually learn from the history of temple destruction in India, if it is taught the way it should be taught, if it is taught in full, in complete, right? Um, if it's taught completely with all the different examples, with all the different reasons, right? And there are many other examples which have nothing to do with the coming of the Turks. um, Probably some have religion as the factor, some have politics as the factor, some have financial issues as the factor, but clearly the idea of temple destruction has got you know only very little to do with the fight between, or the perceived fight between, Hindu and Muslims that we think of today, right? There is also this idea that the NCERT wants to promote, that the way, the makers of the NCERT or the writers of the NCERT think of Hindus and Muslims as being against each other, antagonistic to each other, was also how it was earlier, which is not the case, right? This is one of my favorite examples to give, which is this fight between Jahangir, Mughal Emperor Jahangir, and the general of Ahmednagar, Malik Ambar. Now, for Jahangir is fighting this fantastic Rajput force, and for Malik Ambar is fighting this very talented Maratha force. So it's fascinating. These are two Muslim individuals, if you must put it in those terms that people understand today. But who are fighting for them? Quote unquote, Hindu individuals are fighting for them amongst each other. The Rajputs go and fight the Marathas. When Malik Ambar dies, Shivaji's father, Shaji, who's one of Malik Ambar's right-hand man, he's absolutely distraught by his death. And Jahangir laments the fact that, he could never catch Malik Ambar, he could never defeat Malik Ambar. He creates this dreamscape painting where he's shooting an arrow on Malik Ambar's severed head. But of course, it never happened in real life. So he could only, suffice with the painting. So it's such a fascinating example. In fact, almost all the wars which were fought under the Mughals, starting with Akbar, were fought by a majority of the Rajput forces. And Bijapur Sultanate, Ahmednagar Sultanate, Bidar Sultanate, they all, and even the Bahmani Sultanate before them, they extensively used Maratha forces in their army. And this is how the guerrilla warfare was developed. Malik Ambar is responsible for teaching Marathas what is called as Bargir Giri, right, which is guerrilla warfare, and which also gives them the term Borgis or Bargir, right? Bargir Giri is guerrilla warfare. The person who does guerrilla warfare is Bargir. So this is an art that is perfected by the Marathas in service of the Bahmanis, in service of the Ahmednagar Sultanate, in service of the Bijapur Sultanate. But you will not find any of this in the chapter on Marathas. What will you find in the chapter of Marathas? Shivaji was a devout Hindu. Now, this is just absolutely ahistorical, because this idea of a religion called Hinduism does not exist before the 19th century or 20th century in the subcontinent. It's a colonial construct. You should get to know this just by the name. It ends with an ism. It's clearly a modern construct, right? How many religions have you heard of which end with an ism? None, So you have Vaishnav, you have Shaiv, you have Shakta, right? You have Bodh, you have Jain, right? None of them end in an ism unless you bring it in English. You, of course, have, Vedic religion and Puranic religion. But this idea of Hinduism is very modern concept. It's this umbrella religion which is created by the colonial people, which includes, if you read James Ferguson's writings, I'll come to who he is. If you read his writings, it's very clear he thinks the Buddhist stupa, as well as the Jain Basadi, and a Shaiv temple, as well as a Vaishnav temple, are all the same. they belong to the same religious corpus? They don't. Clearly, they don't. It's a very, very terrible way of, you know, bringing apples and oranges together and saying, well, they are both the same. They are not. you know. So the idea, therefore, is that this was a creation. To use that term with its religious identity onto a 17th century man, that is absolutely ahistorical, to say the least. But more than that, Shivaji never called himself as a Hindu. He never does that. That term is just not there. At that point of time, Hind is a term, or Hindu is a term for denoting ethnicity. So to call Shivaji a devout Hindu, that's absolutely um, ridiculous, right? So that is where the NCERT is at. That's the level. They don't explain, how the Marathas fought for these sultanates for the longest time, etc. And how it wasn't religion but political alliances that actually motivated either the Marathas or the Rajputs to, shake hands with the Mughals or shake hands with the sultanates. They don't say any of this. They are very concerned about telling us that Shivaji was a devout Hindu, a fact that absolutely holds no merit in Indian history. So there is clearly an ideological bias, and the temple destruction, the way temple destruction has been covered, proves that. NCERT would just have you believe that it was Alauddin Khalji that went ahead and destroyed temples in Rameshwaram, but they will never tell you that the Maratha forces during the Third Anglo-Mysore War, 1790 to 1792, went and destroyed the shrine of Shardamba, which is Saraswati. She's a Puranic goddess. Went and destroyed the shrine of Shardamba in this very auspicious, this big, very sacred mutt called the Sringeri mutt. The Maratha general was called Parshuram Bhau. And under him, there was a part of his force that went, led by Raghunath Rao Patwardhan. They went and they destroyed a lot of the Sringeri mutt, but certainly destroyed the shrine of Shardamba, even destroyed her idol. And then there was a very fascinating exchange between the Maratha Peshwa, who is writing to Parshuram Bhau saying, you've not done a very good job, as in, you shouldn't have done this. And I would like you to return the items. So he tells them what items you've looted, right? Because the person who is the Jagat Guru of the Sringeri Mutt, right? A person called Sachidanand. He writes to the Maratha Peshwa saying, your forces have destroyed my mutt. I need these items back. And when you read that, the loot comes to about 60 lakh of rupees that were looted from the Sringeri Mutt by Parshuram Bhau's forces. And in case you think that, Parshuram Bhau didn't do it, somebody from the Maratha forces did it. Parshuram Bhau's brother is Raghunath Rao Patwardhan. He went ahead with his forces and went and, completely wreaked havoc in the Sringeri Mutt. And then while there is an order given by the Maratha Peshwa that go and bring this, to us, bring this, items back and give it to the Sringeri Mutt, we don't know if they ever give it or not. But we do have a correspondence between Tipu Sultan and Sachidanand, the guru of the Sringeri Mutt, the Jagat Guru of the Sringeri Mutt, where Tipu Sultan says, I will give you 400 rahatis. Right? Rahati was this sort of a coin. Tipu had this very fascinating thing of naming different coins for different purposes that they served. So Rahati is relief measure coins, right? So we'll give you 400 Rahatis, which is basically gold coins, right? So that you can rebuild the shrine of Shardamba and you can reinstall her idol. So it's actually Tipu who gets that reinstalled. And of course, NCERT has, certainly not mentioned that. They have in fact not mentioned Tipu at all. They've completely removed Tipu from this. Even 30 years ago, in 1770s, Francis Buchanan, this person who, did extensively traveled in these territories. And how do we know, by the way, that Parshuram Bhau's forces looted the Sringeri Mutt and destroyed the shrine of Shardamba? Because they are allies with the English against Tipu Sultan in the Anglo-Mysore War. So the English have written extensively about this. And it's fascinating. And even the English, were very shocked by the Maratha brutality. And in fact, this force of Parshuram Bhau is notorious for wreaking havoc in all of Mysore. There are areas like Satyagala, etc., where Shudra women were raped. Right? So you will not find any of this example in the NCERT textbook, even in the smallest form at all. Right? But what's interesting is, and it's not about what example is mentioned or what example is not mentioned. It's about creating a narrative that the only people who were using violence somehow were these people, the Muslim rulers. Everyone else who's ruled India has never used violence, of course. They have gone in each other's territories, partied, and said, okay, now you can give me your territory for 10 years. So they've never apparently used violence. And anybody who's sort of read even an iota of history can see very clearly the ideological bias in NCERT's history. But more than that, there is a clear erasure of facts as well. And one of the most important example of this is the Aryan migration, right? I think I don't want to sort of, go overboard, so I'm just going to stop with this example. I'm going to explain this. This is in the class 12th textbook, which has been mildly tweaked, thankfully, right now. It more or less is still, the earlier version, which was written by people who are experts in history. So JNU professors, etc., have written it. People who've studied history for a very long time, have degrees in history. They're actually very good history books. I was the first batch. I did my 12th in 2008-9. So I was the first batch to actually receive these textbooks, right? And they were fascinating, right? They really made me more interested in history. So they've tweaked this and they've introduced this box where they talk about the Aryan migration. And they completely misrepresent this genetic study which happened in Cell. Now, the genetic study in Cell basically just says that the Harappan skeletons that they found in the Harappan region, in the Indus Valley, have the Harappan genome. Right, that's it. That's all that the study says. Okay. It has no other genome but the Harappan genome. Right? It's isolated, which means that this idea that somehow there was some massive contact between the Harappans and the Aryans is incorrect, right? And it completely belies this theory as well of, well, the Harappans eventually became the Aryans. No, right? Because their genetic makeup is very different. And then that study needs to be studied in accordance with another study, which happened also in 2019. It's in another journal called Science, which very clearly says that about 1500 BCE onwards, you have the Aryan genome coming in, the steppe pastoralist genome. Now, these are two different strands, right? And it's so precise, the genetic study, that it can actually tell you that it is the second half of the second millennium BCE that this genetic makeup starts coming. Both these studies make it absolutely clear that there was Aryan migration. But how has it been described in the NCERT? They say that the Cell study shows that there was no Aryan migration. But they are not even talking about Aryan skeletons, skeletons which are steppe pastoralists. They are looking at Harappan. Of course, Harappan civilization was off the subcontinent. There is no doubt about this. There is no question about this. Right? But taken with the Science paper, they actually, give us these two different genetic makeup strands. And most of the subcontinent is made up of different percentages of these strands. But again, stands completely misrepresented. The kid who's reading it, the 13-year-old kid who's reading it is going to go home thinking the Aryan migration never happened, which is exactly the opposite of what the study says. And this is not just the NCERT. This happened even when the 2019 study was out. The paper said something completely different. The paper said what I'm telling you. You can go read the paper. It's very, openly available. But the people who wrote this, Vasant Shinde, Neeraj, etc., Neeraj or Nilesh, I'm not sure what his name is. So one of these, both of these people actually, went ahead and says, so Vasant Shinde made this very interesting statement saying, there is a small movement of people, which is, of course, he's referring to the Aryan migration only, but it's, interesting how they want to sort of completely water it down. It's not a small movement of people. It doesn't happen once. It happens in waves. Hordes and hordes of these Aryans, they come in waves, right? So they're trying to water this down, but at the same point of time, they want to also, be completely not against their own published work. But the problem is everybody is going to hear what Vasant Shinde is saying in this country. Nobody's actually going to read the paper, right? And similarly, now that you have the NCERT, people are only going to, read the NCERT. Most of the people in in India do not opt for history in their class 11th and 12th. So these are the kind of textbooks that they'll be only exposed to. They are not even going to go to college and have possibly better professors. Although, now, even though that is being dismantled, but they will never have a chance to sort of learn a different sort of, learn academic history or history which has some academic basis, which has some basis in historical fact, which is free from this ideological garbage that is being published in the NCERT textbooks. And lastly, I just want to leave you with the impact that it is going to have. These are kids which are 12, 13, right? These are kids who are 12 and 13. They have very impressionable minds, right? It's very, easy to convince them. They get in school thinking they'll receive a certain amount of education, right? You will not expect a 13-year-old child to actually Google and see what the Aryan migration theory is, and if there is genetic evidence that points to, which is contrary to what the NCERT is saying. They're not going to do any of this. They are going to take whatever the NCERT tells them, and they're going to go home thinking that Muslim rulers were all bad. They, destroyed our temples, so it's going to increase the communalization that is already happening in the subcontinent. They are going to, grow up with absolutely ahistorical notions that the Aryan migration never happened. They are going to reject terrible, social realities in India, like caste. They are going to think, well, they were just social realities, whatever that means, vague. And fourth, they're going to find history boring. These are very boring textbooks as well. One of the things that anyway the subcontinent suffers from is that, especially India, is that the history textbooks are made so boring, people could fall asleep. They are also taught so boringly. And if you read these textbooks, they are equally boring, right? So all four of these is, I'm hoping that more and more students will actually find it boring and not take any of this seriously. That's probably the best thing that can come out of this project. But, the language is so polarized. It'll be very difficult for a student to ignore the heavy communal undertones of the NCERT. I'm going to stop with that.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Now let's move on to the question and answer session. Attendees are requested to type their questions in the chat box. In the meantime, we have 3 questions from Salah Sabri in the chat box right now. The first question is that the historical narrative of Kashmir often appears more violent than of many other regions of India. Is this perception historically accurate, or does this primarily arise because of Kashmir's past being more documented uh, in more detailed and continuous textual sources?
Um, I don't think that Kashmir is more violent than, say, the Tamil region during the Bhakti movement or during the Imperial Cholas. The Imperial Cholas are very violent. If you read their inscriptions, they are very proud of the fact that they have destroyed cities, they've burnt cities, women and children were burnt. This person is very brave, he's burnt women and children. They're very proud of this. They go, they destroy, entire city full of Jain temples, right? So when it comes to violence, I would not pinpoint just a particular region in the subcontinent. I would think many regions in the subcontinent throughout different time periods experienced a good deal of violence. So, of course, there is Kashmir, right? But at the same point of time, you have the Tamil region as well, which experienced a lot of violence during the Cholas and during the Bhakti movement. What is interesting, however, is this point that you've made of Kashmir, having this documentation, this tradition to document, which comes largely from Buddhism, right? This Buddhist recording tradition that Romila Thapar also talks about when she's talking about Kalhan's Raj Tarangini. And she says the reason why Kalhan's Raj Tarangini is a very good attempt at actually documenting history. It comes close because before this, anybody who's writing what is considered as history at that point of time is largely, it's very difficult to sort of differentiate between what is actually history and what is actually a myth, right? So they write in this, for example, a lot of the histories at that point of time before Kalhan's Raj Tarangini use the Puranic timeline, which is of the different yugas. So you have Kali Yuga, Satya Yuga, Trita. What does that even mean in chronological terms? How can you translate that? You can't translate that, right? So it is very difficult to actually find, the kind of historical rigor that you see in the Tariq tradition, which comes with the Turks. But there are, sources like Kalhan's Raj Tarangini that come close because of the Buddhist recording tradition, right? And which is why Kalhan has been able to. But even Kalhan is very prone to, resorting to Puranic tropes. So his work is divided in three, right? The first, of course, starts with the Mahabharata period, right? So there's no idea that the Mahabharata in itself possibly could have, not been a history or whatever. He thinks of it as being history. And these are all, things that he's not witnessed himself. This is some, time immemorial sort of. And then, of course, the time period that his father witnessed, because he is the son of Champak, who is this minister in the court of this person, King Harsh. And then, of course, his own eyewitness accounts, right? Especially that of King Harsha's reign, which is very interesting. So he, and it's fascinating to see that when he's talking about the time period from Mahabharata all the way till, say, 7th century Kashmir, he does not know how to make cause and effect, right? He can do cause and effect only when he's actively recording what he's seeing or he's recording from earlier sources, When the time period comes closer to his time, he can actually create cause and effect, right? So there is, of course, the benefit of documentation that we have with Kashmir, right? But violence is documented in Chola sources and inscriptions. There are inscriptions upon inscriptions in the Chola temples, which are all about this guy is amazing because he's so violent. The violence at that point in time is considered as a measure of bravery, which I think is usually how most monarchs would consider themselves to be, right? It's not something that just the Cholas, but Cholas has this unprecedented violence, a lot of violence. So I wouldn't single out Kashmir for that. I would think there are other regions in India which were also violent.
Salah mentions that all of these three questions should be read together. So the second question is that, is there historical evidence to support the claim that rulers adhering to Shaivite traditions were more violent than those following Buddhist or Vaishnava traditions, as is sometimes inferred from examples in Kashmir, Bengal, the Tamil region, and during the Huna period? Or is this interpretation the result of selective reading or later ideological bias? And the third question is that historical sources suggest that Indian policies maintained cordial relations with Muslims even before the establishment of Muslim political rule in these regions. Several rulers reportedly invited Muslim communities to settle, permitted the construction of mosques, and appointed Muslims to important administrative or commercial positions. Despite frequent intra Indian conflicts framed in religious terms, how should these coexistence examples be understood within the broader socio political context of that time?
All right. So, with respect to the second question, right, I would not be able to conclude this at all, that somehow the Shaivite rulers were more violent. No, I would not think that. I don't think their violence has anything to do with them being Shaivites. Maybe very little, but everything else, is to do with their politics. This is something that you will see throughout the subcontinent's history, is that religion is used as a front for violence, right? So you would say that, okay, we are doing this for religion, but it's actually being done for politics, right? It's very clear. So, for example, if I'm going in and killing, say, the Chalukya ruler, right? I am not doing this for religion at all. He may be a different religion, he may be a Vaishnavite, but I'm doing this because I want his territory, because I want to raid his kingdom, because I want to loot him, because I need money, right? But if I do it and if I say that, I'm doing this as a religious exercise, I might have a lot of support from the people, from the clergy, from the noblemen, right, under me, from my generals, etc., who are possibly also of the same religion, right? Which is why, when you have Shaivism and Vaishnavism gaining ground during the Bhakti movement in Tamil Nadu, the rulers are also changing their religious affiliation, because it's politically more prudent for Arikesari Maravarman to now be a Shaivite, right? Earlier, it was prudent for him to be Jain, because most of the people during his time, at that point of time, were adhering to Jainism. So, the personal religious affiliation of the ruler can be used for political purposes, but they alone will not guide his violence. Very rarely. Like I said, we do have examples, but those are actually examples more of temple conversions being governed by, two different religious saints fighting, or two different, religions fighting, but not the king itself, right? So again, these are, the Jains and the Buddhists versus the Shaivites and the Vaishnavites. The king, isn't really part of this discourse, except for the fact that, he will now start giving money to the Shaivites and Vaishnavites because they are now more popular. That's it. He will not go ahead and kill Buddhists and Jains, Very rarely will he do that. So I think that is interesting to see that religion itself is used in a very interesting manner. But religion, more often than not, is not the cause for violence. The cause for violence is political. And of course, your last question, how should this apparent coexistence be understood? I would think that the coexistence, again, the answer is political, right? The coexistence makes sense. The coexistence makes sense for example, the Rajputs to join forces with the Mughals, because it gives the Rajputs big lucrative mansab. They are able to live luxuriously. They are able to, be in the kingdom of, at that point of time, the most powerful kingdom in the subcontinent, right? The Mughal kingdom. So it's a very prudent choice. Again, a very politically prudent choice. Similarly, for the Marathas down, they are seeking employment in the Bahmani Sultanate. They are seeking employment in the Bijapuri Sultanate. They are seeking employment with the Ahmadnagar Sultanate, because they are all lucrative jobs, and they should have it. These are all very politically prudent decisions that they are taking. They are not thinking, oh, they are from a different religion, I should not join them. they're going ahead and joining them because it's politically prudent. Similarly, when you have the Battle of Khanwa, you have Babur, right? And even before the Battle of Khanwa, the Battle of Panipat, the second one, the 1526, right? You have that fantastic battle, and Babur has less Muslim people in the subcontinent supporting him. More Muslims are actually supporting Ibrahim Lodi, right? Simply because he's off the subcontinent, right? In fact, you even have forces like Rana Sanga, etc., who go ahead and say, that tell Babur that, we will help you eventually. But they end up not, helping him. Hassan Khan Mewati, for example, is a very good example. He supports Rana Sanga during the Battle of Khanwa. He does not support Babur, thinking, oh, Babur is my religion, I should go support him. No. Hassan Khan Mewati is a Mewari lord, and he supports Rana Sanga. Ibrahim Lodi's brother, right, after the defeat of Ibrahim Lodi, again supports Rana Sanga because he thinks it's in his political interest to not support Babur. So I think the coexistence made sense politically, pragmatically, and therefore the coexistence existed.
Imam, there's another question by Abul Fazl Dastagir. Has there been any resistance from academicians against this state-sponsored distortion of history?
I am an academic. I have a MA, MPhil, and PhD in history. So, and I do constantly talk against the state-sponsored distortion of history. So I would think yes. But is it enough? I would think no, there needs to be more because the level of distortion is too much. But you also have to see that one is sponsored by the state, which means there is a lot that is going into it. There's a lot of monetary push. There is, the state is with you, basically. You have complete impunity. And against that is, of course, organized, not very organized individual protests, etc., of people either talking about the correct, version of history or protesting against the government or whatever. These are all not very organized and not very sponsored. And also people, a lot of people, for example, fear for their jobs. A lot of them are teaching in government institutions. So how much can they actually come forth and speak against the government, right? And the state-sponsored distortion of history. There is also this added danger. Tomorrow the state might not like what you're saying, and they could file some case against you. Some random person could file some case against you. Doesn't even have to be the state, because the state is given full reign and impunity to a lot of these quote unquote, fringe elements. So some of these fringe elements, the Bajrang Dal, etc., might do it. Some of them don't even have to file a case against you. They could just, like remove you from the scene, to put it mildly, right? So there are all sorts of ways which can cause an obstacle in coming out against this. But I still think that more could be done from the academic side than what is being done. So while there is some resistance, there should be more, in my opinion.
There are a lot more questions in the chat box, actually. There's another one by Abhishek Rai, which says that, great to hear you, ma'am. Can you please elaborate on ADI Shankaracharya movement during the 6th and 7th century and his campaign against Buddhism? Is Buddhism the first that counters the Brahmanical idea back 2000 years? How do you see Brahmanical forces establishment in South India, and are there any differences between South and North Indian Brahmanical ideas?
Yes, Buddhism is one of the more prominent and one of the early prominent resistance against Brahmanical hegemony, against the hegemony of the Vedas. And then, of course, there's Jainism. as well, but Buddhism is far more vocal. Both of them are also different because they preach in Prakrits, which is the language of the people, which is why they're very popular, right? As opposed to the Vedic religion, which was largely in Sanskrit. So they're not very popular, right? In the sense that um, people have trouble, understanding the Vedas. So they need an intermediary, which gives the Brahmins a lot of power, right? Because they are the only ones who can speak Sanskrit, who can write, and who can, preach in Sanskrit, etc. Not only because it's Sanskrit and Sanskrit is considered as the language of gods, but also because they have the caste right to do so. So caste is very important over here. So yes, Buddhism is the first, and therefore it's a very powerful movement, and it precipitates change at some very interesting level of causing the Brahmins to write the Puranas. And the Puranas constantly talk about the crisis. What kind of crisis? The crisis of Varna Shankara, mixing of castes. Because the Brahmanical hegemony stands challenged, right? And the Puranas are constantly talking, therefore they talk about the Kali Yuga, right? The Kali age, which is basically this, that, their authority is being challenged. People are not, following caste rules, right? There's mixing of caste, caste endogamy is not being practiced, this, that, and the other. Right? Buddhism and Jainism sort of precipitate this change, right? And the Puranas taking cognizant of it, and constantly talk of a crisis, etc. Therefore, once the Puranas have been able to establish, the Shaivite and Vaishnavite bhakti as popular, etc. There is this backlash against Buddhism and Jainism, right? Which you start seeing in 7th, 8th, 9th century onwards. Even rulers like Shashank, etc., who are rival to rulers like Harsha. This is not that Harsha, Kashmir Harsha. This is the Harsha of Kannauj. So Harsha is a Buddhist, and Shashank is a Shaivite. And there is a constant fight between the two, of course, for political reasons. But Shashank also hates Buddhism. Hyeon Sang says he went and uprooted the Bodhi tree and set fire to it and broke the idol of Buddha, and then there installed the idol of Shiv. And so it's fascinating as to how then there is a whole backlash of Puranic religions against Jainism and Buddhism. So, but yes, to come back to your point, Buddhism is the first.
There's another question by Akshay Mehta, who says that Vedas in the current form wouldn't be possible outside of India. There would have been a proto-form, but the retroflux sounds are the result of the language mixing with Dravidian or Mundus languages. He says proto-Vedas because a lot of the words are there in the Iranian Avesta too, Haravati, caste system, Devas, etc. The same could be said about the Mitanni civilization. So there were multiple waves of steppe people who left their region and started settling in different areas. So the question he has is that were these Vedic people, French and expansionists, that everyone that stumbled upon them, Iranians, Buddhists, or Jains, did they hate them or wanted them to be aloof, or were the ideas that they propagated? Wanted them to be aloof of the ideas that they propagated.
Where is this question? Can I read it? Because I didn't understand any of it.
It's Akshay Mehta, 10:02 p.m.
Okay. I'm just quickly going to, come to the question. The question I have is, were the Vedic people fringe and expansionist? That everyone that stumbled upon them hated them or wanted to be... Where is the historical evidence for the fact that the Vedic people were hated? And why were they fringe? The Vedic people were primarily Brahmins. If they were fringe, they would still not be ruling the caste system in the subcontinent. They're one of the most privileged people in the country even now. I don't think they were fringe ever. And the hatred, that you're talking about, again, very marginal, because if it was any good deal of hatred against the Vedic people per se, the Brahmins, it would have led to the Brahmins no longer being leaders of the caste system. They continue to be leaders of the caste system because the hatred has not been expressed well enough.
There is another question by MV, who
Mhm.
says that the information about the mass
I am
carnage.
sorry, Raid, I'm only going to be able to take two more questions because
Right.
I
Okay.
have to, yeah.
Uh, so we can take the question by MV, who says that the mass carnage carried out by Raja Narendra of the 11th century Eastern Chalukya dynasty against the Buddhists of Andhra region is often discussed. What is the extent of truth regarding this event?
Sorry, is this the only question? Because he writes something else.
Yeah,
The
I think
events of
that's a
13th
different
century,
question. Yeah.
Pashupad attack, and these are two different. Okay, so these are two different time periods that you're talking of. One is, of course, the 11th century, and the other one is, of course, the 13th century. Um, but yes, so while I have discussed the 8th, 9th, 10th century, displacement of Buddhism and Jainism in the in the southern half of the subcontinent, um, that is carried forward in 11th, 12th, 13th century, clearly with the coming of Veer Shaivism. And just like you had it in the Bhakti movement, you have it here as well, where there is a whole movement of converting Jain shrines into Shaiva shrines. So you have the Megudi temple in Hallur, the temple, Dodappa temple in Adichanallur, right? Julia Wald, Hegewald has written extensively about this. You can go read her work, where she talks as to how there is this constant need to not just displace gens, and much like it was done in the Alvar and Naina times. You have the Basava Puran as well, which says something similar. The Jains should have their skull open, violently opened, right? Not like just randomly open, but like violently opened. They should, you know, have their skull smashed. So there is a very violent sort of an uprising against them, which manifests in the temple conversion as well, right? So this actually starts from the 7th and continues all the way up till the 13th century. By then, certainly Buddhism has declined, right? There is no doubt about that. But even Jainism has become, almost at the back, right? Again, one of those very small group of religions sustained by merchants, largely in the Gujarat area. So you have a lot of these Sah merchants, right, were Jain, and therefore they are sustaining. Even during Aurangzeb's time, you had Shanti Das Jawahari, who's a Jain, right, and you had these temples in Rajasthan, in Gujarat, Girnar, etc., Shatrunjay, etc., right? But again, they are very small as compared to the Puranic religions. And this also is reflective of what is the population of Jains today. So, yes, there is this clear movement of displacing Buddhism in Jain. I think your sort of examples fit into that.
Ma'am, if you're open to
One more
taking another
question.
question. Yeah,
Yeah, one more.
Amartya Chakraborty has a question on the Ahoms and wants to know, points out several examples of Ahom kings patronizing Hindu temples and constructing Umananda temples. And he wants to know if these people are also called foreigners, like the Sultans of Delhi, because they are from the Yunnan region, which is in China at the moment.
They're not. Um, but I will not call anybody who has entered the subcontinent before 1947, which is when the current territory of India was born, as a foreigner to the subcontinent. What does a foreigner even mean at that point of time? You had the Kushans, who were coming in. And these are people who come from the China region, the Yuchi tribe, right? And they are elevated because, they make friends with the Brahmins. They are elevated to the status of Devaputra, sons of gods. So this idea that somehow, these people are foreigners, so we will not exist with them or we will not treat them well, this, that, and the other. I highly doubt it existed as some territorial thing. What is the territory of the subcontinent at that point in time? The territory is very porous. There is no one fixed territory, right? So the subcontinent as a whole, including areas of Afghanistan, Pakistan, there are trade relations, active trade relations with China, right? There are active trade relations with Burma. So you have Chola style temples in Burma. You have Chola, traders living there. So, I would not use the appellation foreigner for any of these people who were part of the subcontinent. This is my problem. And this is why I bring in the Aryan migration, because either you call everybody then, who came outside of the subcontinent, starting with the Aryans, as foreigners, or you don't call any of them. Because the idea of calling Mughals as foreigners is clearly incorrect, because, well, this has been the history of the subcontinent. Rulers have come and, they've come from outside of the subcontinent and they've become part of the subcontinent and part of the subcontinent's history. All right. Are we done? Right.
Yes, ma'am, we're done. We'll head to the conclusion of the event. Uh, Ma'am, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a delightful webinar, and thank you so much for taking your time to answer so many questions. The talk was very detailed, very engaging, and very thought-provoking. And it not only illuminated the facts and nuances of historical interpretation, but also demonstrated the careful methodology and evidence-based reasoning that are essential to understanding the past accurately. For everyone here today, your session serves as a reminder that history is not static, but a living conversation that shapes how we perceive society, culture, and civic life. On behalf of the Indian History Forum, thank you, Dr. Sharma, for generously sharing your expertise and perspectives today. Your dedication to both academic scholarship and public engagement, including YouTube, podcasts, TV debates, etc., serve as a powerful example of how historical research can reach broader audiences and inform public understanding. To all of you attending today, thank you for your engagement, attention, and thoughtful participation. By being part of this session, you're supporting the forum's mission of advancing inclusive and balanced history and contributing to spaces where students, scholars, and the public can interact and share India's larger legacy. We encourage all of you to follow the forum's Instagram page and our website. Stay connected with us so that you can connected with the upcoming webinars, publications, and the exhibition, which will showcase historical research for everyone here. Again, thank you, ma'am, and thank you to the forum's organizing committee, collaborators, and the entire team whose guidance and hard work today made the session possible. Your dedication ensures that discussions around history remain rigorous, inclusive, and accessible to all audiences. We hope that all of you will continue engaging with the Indian History Forum through future webinars, discussions, etc. These initiatives are designed to make historical scholarship not only visible, but also meaningful. Thank you again, Dr. Ruchika Sharma, to all of the attendees today and everyone who
Thank you,
contributed to making
Ryan.
this session a
And
success.
thank you, everyone who was part of this and who, I'm sorry I couldn't take all your questions, but thank you, everyone who asked questions, and they were very good, incisive questions. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, and have a
All
wonderful
right.
evening, everyone.
Thank you.